Alright, so the previous video cut off as I was speaking. So I'm just going to go back again quickly to this one. For the EIC, again, what I was saying was one of the biggest issues is some of the answers are given to questions that don't require an answer. There are questions that say either or, and only one of the two questions apply, and then as soon as one is answered, the other doesn't need to be answered. And preparers sometimes do answer both. So that's what these questions are ensuring, to make sure the other question is taken off. And from experience, it's been like 4B, for example, if I'm not mistaken, is the one where it's the relating to the dependent's age um, or disability. And if one of them is answered yes, the other one doesn't need to be answered. But anyways, it was kind of long-winded. I hope I didn't confuse you. Let's move on to the education credits. For the education credits, the name has to be entered again for the student. So this is a manual entry. Make sure this is just the first and last name. The middle name doesn't need to be entered. Ask the taxpayer for things again, these questions, because again, you're not just assuming everything that's there and just looking at it, because that's one part, the data entry verification. The other part is making sure they can qualify, or if they have gotten all the credits or deductions that they qualify for. So you want to make sure the expenses qualify, if it's American Opportunity Credit versus lifetime learning. If it's lifetime learning, then you should right away um, have an alarm go off if you see something that is there for books, because the books have a very stringent condition to meet. So you want to ask them, were these books purchased from the educational institution, and were they required to be purchased as part of the education? That's an example. That's something you would ask. So a lot of these questions for the education credits is going to be actually asking the taxpayer for these things, and making sure. And sometimes it's possible that the taxpayer didn't enter expenses. No one asked the taxpayer if they have expenses for books. They just, included the expenses for the education that they pay to the college. So you should ask those things again to make sure they're included, and the taxpayer gets that. Heading on to New York State, it's pretty simple. With this one, you just follow the instruction of what it says here. Just so you have an understanding, if you already are not aware, people who live in New York City, which are the five boroughs, Queens, Brooklyn, Bronx, Manhattan, or Staten Island, also have to pay New York City income taxes. People who don't live in New York City do not have to pay. So some of these questions are trying to find out if the taxpayer was a resident of the five boroughs, and you can see how this is important, because they either will have a tax liability for New York City, and that will enter in their calculation, or if they don't live in New York City, it won't. So questions about whether the taxpayer and the spouse, if they're a resident of the five boroughs, the number of days they lived in New York City, and if they don't live in New York City at all, then you make sure it's 0, and make sure the full year resident is not checked, because if you do check that, then the software is going to assume that they live in New York City, and the software is going to calculate taxes based on that. And if the taxpayer qualifies for any education credit, make sure the 272 is filled out, and it's filled out correctly, because the tax preparers may not be familiar, or they may accidentally just copy the expenses from the federal, but for New York State, the requirements for the education credit is different. Books and materials generally are not deductible, well, includable as part of expenses that you can get a credit for. So look at that. And then these two questions don't generally apply, but if you just go through them and look at that and just follow those instructions. So that's going through the review checklist. And again, when you're going through the review, you should have an inquiring mind, and you should be trying to look at the bigger picture. for the tax preparer. You're not only checking, everything that's in front of you, because part of the review is making sure the things that are not in front of you that were never entered are entered, and the only way you can do that is by asking questions. So do not be afraid to ask the preparer or the tax preparer or even the taxpayer the questions to come up with these answers when you need to. And then the other part, the obvious part, is checking the data entry portion, which is a simple part. All right, I hope this helps when you're reviewing the tax returns.